and a warm welcome to you all registered for this session. I'm Srinivasan Chari, and I will be in conversation with a very esteemed guest speaker for the session today. Before I get to introducing our guest speaker, I would like to share a thought here. IoT Asia 2022, we are getting to hear from experts and seeing solutions in actions in the emerging tech space of IoT, edge, computing, AI, and 5G. As we see the advent of these technologies in making customer service better business operations, safer for the people, we are increasingly hearing that all these technology innovations need to be sustainable innovations. There is a very clear focus on the sustainability aspect of technology innovation. And with this context, I'd like to introduce or take the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker today for today's session. I have with me Mr. Arun Biswas, Senior Partner from IBM Consulting, Asia Pacific. He's also spearheading the sustainability business and solutions services for IBM in the region. Arun is a senior veteran in the consulting and technology industry and has worked in multiple markets, including Asia Pacific today. Specifically today, we would like to hear from Arun on how he's seeing the industry and technology address the challenges of sustainability in the area of travel, transportation, and logistics. So Arun, a big welcome to the session today.
Very good afternoon, Srini, and lovely to be here with you once again. Looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Arun, as you're aware, at IoT Asia, in the run-up to the event, we have reached out to many industry stakeholders and audiences. We have tried to collect from them what are the areas of interest for them that they would like to hear through this event. On the topic of sustainability, we found an overwhelming response from the audience that they would like to understand more about the trends in sustainability related to travel, transportation, and logistics. I'm definitely very curious to understand why the topic of sustainability is so critical to an industry like travel, transportation, and logistics. Would be great to start with some of your perspectives about this industry.
Thanks, Srini. And very topical question. And I'll focus on one area of sustainability, which is emissions and climate change. Now, Srini, as you know, that the transport industry is a very important industry sector for our entire economy. It also happens to be one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. So it accounts roughly for about 20% of the total greenhouse gas emissions today. But here is the bigger problem. The industry is expected to grow. And roughly by 2050, it'll be 2.5 times its current size. So unless we start aggressively decarbonizing, this industry will become the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, and we'll have a much bigger problem.
Wow, so you're saying 20% of the greenhouse gas today coming from all of the sources can be attributable to travel, transportation, and logistics industry. I think we have an amazingly informed audience that has requested us to focus on this aspect. So I think very right to select this industry for this conversation. Right. Moving a little ahead, I think if sustainability is such a key aspect of this industry, is there a method to the madness, as we say, Arun, in addressing decarbonization or achieving net zero for this industry or this domain, right? As in, it's a very vast industry space. There are many aspects to this industry. They all cannot be addressed with one solution. So in your experience and what you're doing with your clients and stakeholders, how do you see the approach to this industry and this industry problem?
Right. So first of all, I'll start off by looking at the problem in a bit more detail, because the transport industry consists of multiple segments, Srini: road, rail, air, shipping.
Absolutely.
Now, of all of this, road transport, both passenger and freight, accounts for roughly 3/4 of the total emissions. Air travel is roughly about 11%, shipping is about 10%, and rail is only 1%, right? So in a way, the biggest problem area is road transport. And when we start looking at solutions to decarbonize, there are multiple pathways. And I'll probably group these solutions into 4 broad categories. The first category, Srini, is all about looking at fuel, because most of the emissions are as a result of fuel, the fuel which all these transport methods use, right? So moving away from use of fossil fuels like oil and gas to clean electricity is a big shift which we need to make. Now, it's important to reflect here that the transport industry is dependent on the electricity and utilities industry to provide clean electricity. Because if your electric vehicle is powered by electricity from a coal-fired plant, that's not helping, right?
True.
Now, while electrification has become a viable alternative for road and rail transport, it is still not viable for airlines and shipping. So there we need to look at alternative fuels such as green hydrogen, biodiesel, etc. So the first point which we need to really focus on is how do we move this industry away from use of fossil fuels. But that's not all, right? The second area we also need to think about is how do we continue to improve fuel efficiency? Because much as we may want everything to become electric, the internal combustion engine is going to stay with us for a long time.
Right.
It is estimated that even the most optimistic estimates are that most companies will not be able to get to 100% electric before 2050. Even by 2035, we'll have some countries moving over to 100% new electric vehicles only. So it's important for us to continue driving fuel efficiency in the current legacy kind of transport mechanisms which are available. And fuel efficiency, as you know, Srini, can be achieved in multiple ways, right? From driving better customer behavior or better driver behavior, to better roads, to better equipment maintenance, better infrastructure like ports, etc., and so on, right? The third way, Srini, to reduce emissions is by driving more sharing of assets and circularity. And this is where all these new ways of using transport like Uber, Grab, and all come in. And circularity is also important because we need to use less materials while producing cars, vehicles, etc., and also drive more recycling, other forms of waste management, etc., and so on. And the final area, which is probably not very well at this point in time, understood, is climate risk, and the risks due to impact of extreme weather events like floods, hurricanes, snowstorms are only going to increase. And you might have recently read the IPCC report, which came out last week, which predicts that this is only going to get worse, right? And better weather forecasting could help in preventing massive losses and damages that in turn could reduce emissions in the industry.
Fantastic. Great points, Arun. I think if I can summarize, you're pointing to 3 or 4 key areas within the travel, transportation, and logistic industry. One of them is how to address the fuel source consumption itself. How do we get vehicles or logistics assets to move away from fossil fuels as much as possible? So that is one. You said whatever you're consuming it efficiently. So more distance covered for the unit fuel that you're consuming. So I think that's the second point I think we and the audience will take away. Sharing of assets is something you're bringing in, and which we are seeing in the example you gave, the Uber and the cab and Grab here in Singapore is what we're seeing. Sharing the assets between us so that we are using it efficiently. So I think that's the third one. The fourth one, very important one, is the climate risk management that you're calling out, right? So I think excellent perspective to the way one can approach the travel and transportation industry, right? I think the way you explain it, I'm able to relate to some of the examples, Arun, that I've been fortunate enough to see happen out there. And I'll probably share one here. Maybe you know more, and we'll look for you to share more of these examples. I heard the largest port in Europe, the port of Rotterdam, has over the past few years, partnering, of course, with IBM and other technology partners, put sensors around the port and in the port to measure vital information like wind speed, waves, tide, etc. They are gathering this information to be able to predict when will the conditions be so optimal that a ship can come in, dock, load, unload, and go back with the most fuel efficient performance. So I think that is kind of somewhere telling me that the examples you are giving and the areas you're pointing us to is so relevant. So that means, can emerging technologies be used so effectively to address the 4 areas that you just mentioned about. So would like to understand from you how emerging technology should be put to use to address exactly the 3 or 4 pillars that have guided us to.
Sure. And emerging technologies like IoT, AI, blockchain, etc., will have a huge role to play in addressing these decarbonization challenges. And you gave an excellent example of port infrastructure, right? And if I look at the 4 categories I talked about earlier, the first one was emissions reduction. If you think of it, today, one of the big gaps we have in the way we are tracking and monitoring emissions is that we really don't have real-time data and information. So if you look at vehicles, if I ask you how much exactly is your car emitting, you will be hard pressed to find that information, right? So we need better sensors, we need better IoT devices, but just not IoT. We need to be able to gather that information, make sense of it. So you need some form of data and analytics solutions. And because this data is so huge, you can't do without AI, and then you need cloud because you can't store this data somewhere, so on. And when it comes to sharing the data, you need something which can be trusted. So that is where blockchain comes in. So you can see very soon how an interplay of all these kind of new and emerging technologies are going to be extremely important in managing just tracking, this basic tracking and monitoring and managing of emission stream.
Absolutely. That kind of tells me, you spoke about emission and the way sensors and can gather the data and tell us what it is. So I go back to a very age-old industry saying that what you can't measure, you can't improve. So you're exactly pointing out to that. But we also hear about things like predictive maintenance of equipments and connected vehicles out there which are sharing more information. So are these addressing the point that you're making, that we should be able to collect the information about some of these things? So what are those use cases that you think will definitely help us in the emerging technology space?
Absolutely. And I mean, you talked about connected vehicles, right? That is such an important kind of solution pattern, and that is going to be used in so many different ways. Think about things like just influencing driver behavior. Connected vehicles can help give feedback to the drivers as to how they're driving, improve their driving so that they are spending less fuel, and consequently there's less emissions and so on. You talked about asset maintenance. I mean, each of the transport industry is asset heavy. I mean, you have cars, you have trucks, you have planes, you have ships, and the way you manage and maintain them, and through the use of, again, IoT devices, AI, etc., to be able to optimize maintenance cycles, make sure that the fuel efficiency is maintained even for old and legacy assets. And that's going to be extremely important, because think of something like shipping, for example. I mean, you don't build ships every day, right? Ships built today will last for 10 years. Decades. So you have to really continue to maintain them, and the only way you can do that is by having these kind of use of technologies in the maintenance area and so on. So all of these are relevant examples to be able to address the whole fuel efficiency part.
I'll probably then share something that I'm noticing as well here in Singapore, Arun, and that is creating digital twins of the infrastructure. Right? For example, Singapore Land Authority is already working on a concept where they can create a digital twin of Singapore city, capture real-time information of what is the traffic, what is the weather, what is the real congestion at various places, and be informed to take specific actions, right? So in terms of city planning, town planning, road and infrastructure planning, etc. Looks like from what you're guiding us, those kind of initiatives are really going to help us be more sustainable in the future. Are there more examples like that you know of around the world where we are seeing similar actions being taken?
Absolutely, and I think Europe is leading the way in many ways, right? So we are working with the city of Copenhagen. Mm-hmm. We are working with the city of Madrid in similar kind of city infrastructure design, which helps us kind of make transportation much more smoother, reduce emissions, and so on there, right? And think of it, I mean, that's almost, in a way, more and more of the human population is going to increasingly live in cities than urban areas. There is going to be a huge kind of migration of population. So the design of city infrastructure and how it impacts transportation is going to be extremely critical. So these kind of new models which are coming up from Europe, the new models which LTA in Singapore is building, these are going to be important, I would say, early pilots and experiments which we'll have to study and quickly replicate at scale.
Fantastic. So if I summarize quickly, your view that the emerging technologies have a very vital role to play in the travel and transportation industry to help us decarbonize, and you clearly guiding us that sensors can collect the data, the large amounts of data can be managed by good data management practices. AI can help us analyze and generate the insights so that we can take corrective actions. On the cloud, these solutions can give us great agility. And lastly, with something like blockchain, you can build trust across the data that's flowing in the value chain, saying, am I using a green service or not a very green service? So I think fantastic insights, Arun, here. We can clearly see how emerging technologies can play a vital role to help us. That kind of brings me to a point that, the examples that you spoke of don't seem very simple, right? So what would be your guiding post for our audience, that how do one get started towards adopting some of these emerging technologies, right, and to reach the final state that you described? So is there a industry best practice? Is there a guidance that you can provide, saying how does one get started towards adopting some of these?
And this is a question I get asked a lot, Srini, because genuinely, I mean, for business leaders today, there is so much to do, right? And the hardest part is that you are actually running businesses under very difficult circumstances. You have a pandemic going on, you have massive transformation, which you need to drive within organizations. And then you have this added kind of burden of sustainability, so on and so forth. So there are three ways I would urge business leaders to look about how to start harnessing emerging technologies. The first thing is data. As you would realize, much of these technologies, they require underlying foundation of data, which is clean, which is reliable, which is trusted, which is secure, and so on. Whether you talk about AI, you have to talk about IoT, blockchain, etc., and so on, right? So start with making sure that you have good, clean data. And when you think about climate change, sustainability, and all that, it is not just your internal data. You will have to build organizational muscle to get in much more external data, like environment data, weather data, right, and new types of data, and so on. So start with a strong data foundation if you already don't have one, and that will be a best starting point. Second, let's make sure that you are very clear about your objectives, KPIs, and metrics, because today many organizations are treating all of this as more a compliance issue. Right. While compliance and regulation is important, I would urge business leaders to think of this as an opportunity to really rethink their operations and even their business models, and look at sustainability and climate change not just as a burden or as a cost of doing business, but as a huge opportunity and as a pivot to their business. Thirdly, Srini, I'll point out the power of ecosystems. This is not something any one company can do on their own. So you need industry-wide ecosystems. You actually need cross-industry ecosystems. I talked about how the transportation industry depends on the electricity and utilities industry. For example, I mean, the two industries need to collaborate with each other to manage emissions. And then you think about how transportation industry needs to interact with cities, with the city government. So the collaboration between private and the government sectors, collaboration between academia, who are doing research, and other kind of research institutions. So this is a massive ecosystem play. So I would also urge business leaders in the transportation and logistics industry to think much more wider and see how they can co-opt the entire ecosystem. Lastly, I think, Srini, it's very important to keep in mind that for many business leaders, this is now a challenge of how to move away from narrow shareholder value kind of concept for their business to much broader stakeholder engagement, because sustainability impacts everybody. And the pressures on business are from multiple directions, not just from shareholders, but also from their customers who are demanding green products, from their employees who want to be associated with green companies. It is becoming a huge attractor for talent. True. And in case, especially young talent. And also, you have regulators, you have other kind of industry participants, and then the general society, right?
Citizens.
Citizens who are demanding that an organization be sustainable. So just redefining your purpose as a business and looking at a broader range and as to how you are creating value, not just value for the shareholders through financial returns, but how are you creating broader value for the whole society would be the last thing I'll point out, Srini.
Wonderful. So quickly summarizing, arrange for the right data, internal and external, focus on the right metrics that you want to achieve on the sustainability angle, build an ecosystem approach rather than going about it alone, keep the wider stakeholder group in mind when you're designing your sustainability system. Those are the 4 inputs that you're giving that we kind of keep in mind when we are starting with something like this. So wonderful. Arun, I can't quantify how valuable your inputs and insights have been in the last 20 minutes. I'm sure our audience found it equally so, right? Thankful to you for taking time out today to come and speak on such an important topic of decarbonization and the role of technologies in the travel, transportation, and logistics space. Thank you so much for your time, Arun.